I want to introduce you to Sean Ammirati. And what you need to know about Sean is he's highly connected into the tech world, not hyper connected in Pittsburgh, but very connected all over the world, really. He's a professor of entrepreneurship here at CMU, and he's also the lead organizer, lead planner of the Corporate Startup Lab. So for his job, he interacts with corporations, established corporations, and teaches them how to think like an entrepreneur and teaches them how to innovate. And so for us in our time, we get him to take us through this journey, through thinking, through a panel discussion, through an interactive product creation this afternoon on us as established or somewhat established organizations. How do we start thinking innovatively and creatively? He's also written a book called The Science of Growth that really answers what I just all described. He's investment, he does investments. There's like this list that will get created if I keep going and going. But above all, I loves Jesus. We've gotten to know each other now since March, had several conversations, and above all of those things I just said, fundamentally loves Jesus, and that's pretty cool that all those things go together. And so why don't we give a super warm, thankful welcome that Sean's going to be with us. Take it away, Sean.
Thanks. So it really is an honor to get to spend the afternoon with you guys. So thanks for allowing me the time, and thanks for coming to Pittsburgh to be part of this. The title of the talk this afternoon for the next 40 minutes is Corporate Entrepreneurship. There's often a little bit of a kind of recoil when I go out and talk to different companies about this topic of corporate entrepreneurship, because people think these are like oxymorons, like jumbo shrimp, right? But I actually really believe that entrepreneurship is an activity that can't any longer be relegated to 20-somethings in skinny jeans walking around campus here. And we have a lot of those types of entrepreneurs here, but I believe entrepreneurship is something that everybody needs to partake in. So when I use the word entrepreneurship, what I'm talking about is people who look out into the world, see things that aren't as the world should be, and build products and services that make the world as it should be. This definition is used almost everywhere I talk. When I talk to people about entrepreneurship, I say, when you're being an entrepreneur, what you're doing is you're seeing things that aren't in the world as they should be, and then you're making the world as it should be. Now, in a room like this, one thing I think that's important to say is that's why it's really important that Christians take their seat at the table as entrepreneurs, because every single thing that's happened in the world, you can point to an entrepreneur who helped create that, right? To illustrate this, imagine that you fell asleep and woke up 20 years later today, and this was the first time walking around for 20 years, right? You'd walk down and you'd have seen, a newspaper in your hotel lobby. It's probably the only place you could find a newspaper today, but a newspaper in your hotel lobby, right? And people be doing something with their phone that kind of looks like what you thought was a computer. And you'd see an article about self-driving cars, and then you'd see someone do something with their phone and a car pulls up and drives them to another place and lets them off, right? Each of those different things that would feel completely foreign to you, you can point to a person or a group of people who imagined that product, said the world needs a product or service like this, and then went and created that. Every single one of those products was not created by a brand new company, right? So I know Josh spoke last night, right? The product that Apple created was not a new startup, that was a corporate startup. Apple had been around for a long time. So entrepreneurship is not just brand new companies, but this activity is something that we all need to do. Before doing all the things that James talked about, I spent 12 years creating and selling 3 startups back to back. So I was a graduate student here. So I dropped out of graduate school. I told my professor and advisor that the only thing I knew for sure was that I did not want to be a professor, which is ironic. He does stop by my office about once a week to remind me how good I am at predicting the future. But in between those two things, I went and started and sold 3 companies. So I started a machine learning company, which we sold to Morgan Stanley. The one that you probably would be most likely to be familiar with is if you've logged into your LinkedIn account and you've seen that ribbon of news across the top called LinkedIn Today. That's the technology that we built at MSpoke. I was the CEO and founder there. That was LinkedIn's first acquisition, and then I started a third company that we sold to a PE roll-up. Towards the tail end of that third startup, I came back and started teaching here at Carnegie Mellon. And I really think about what I do today as basically spending all my time trying to convince other people to be entrepreneurs, right? So some of that is I'm a partner at a venture capital firm. So at any given time, I'm on 10 entrepreneurs' boards, working with them on their startup very closely. Kind of the next concentric circle out, at any given time, I have roughly 100 to 200 grad students that I'm in some conversation with about their career and how they can be more entrepreneurial. And then I, as James said, I wrote a book and do a bit of this kind of rubber chicken circuit speaking, which I think of as sort of the next concentric circle out, talking about entrepreneurship. Relevant for today is I also started and run the corporate startup lab here, where we proactively work to help companies realize that they weren't just once entrepreneurial when that company was started, but there still can be and need to be entrepreneurial today. And you meet some resistance when you come out with that message, but then you show them charts like this, and it's kind of hard to dispute. This is what they call a cohort analysis. That means you take all the companies that were on the S&P 500 at any point in time. They call that a cohort of companies on the S&P 500 at any given time, and you see how long do they stay on that list. So what's the average lifespan? And so you can see from 1955 to today, that line is sloping down dramatically. So all that means is if you get to this place that many companies when they were started would have imagined of being successful, so imagine you're in a garage somewhere, proverbial or otherwise, and you're starting a company, and you think, man, someday I hope to make the S&P 500 list, right? You know, when you were in 1955, if you'd done that, if you're the CEO, not only for your whole time as a CEO is that company probably safe, but whoever takes over for you and maybe whoever takes over for him, you guys are probably all safe, right? Today we're talking about 17 years. That window is shrinking dramatically. So to me, the point is not just that the line's sloping down, it's how fast that's sloping down. And the reason is really simple. The things that got those companies on that list won't keep them there. The only way that they can remain relevant is coming back to being more entrepreneurial. And I think the same thing is true for all of your organizations. So my hypothesis is that the things that got your organizations to the places of influence that they are today won't keep them there. You need to go create that future. And then one thing that becomes interesting is quickly the conversations with executives, when I sit across the table from a CEO and I'm talking about this, it quickly turns to this like, okay, well, like what kind of creating the future, right? You know, often they were trained in engineering or something like that, so they want like a really pragmatic answer to that. So I found this is a very helpful way to frame that out. I think about this as, you know, on some level, just really a 3x3 matrix, but you're sort of just concentrically going out. So this is, are you using existing products or are you using brand new products and assets in your organization? And this is, are you serving your existing customers or are you serving brand new customers, right? And the idea is some amount of what you're gonna do is just make your existing products that serve your existing customers better. So, you know, you have a product, you make it 3% faster. You have a product, you change it from silver to gray, which is kind of the same color, but your designer tells you that's gonna make it much better. There's not a lot of designers in the room, obviously. That usually gets a better laugh than that. But you know, they're sort of core innovation, right? Then there's like, okay, one of those two is either a new market or it's a new solution, right? That's kind of adjacent innovation. And then there's completely transformational innovation, right? Where you're going and solving new unknown problems with new unknown solutions. And my argument is it's that kind of innovation that is actually what keeps you from disappearing if you're on the S&P 500 list, or more generally, it just keeps you from disappearing, right? So, and to do that, right, we come back to my definition of entrepreneurship, right? To do that, you need people in your organization, and it can't just be you, it's gotta be everybody in your organization looking out and saying like, okay, what does the world need that we're not doing today? How do we build products and services that do that? And the reality is that when you're doing this activity out here, your batting average is just going to be less than it is down here, right? And so when you're doing this kind of thing, you've got to operate differently. One more vocabulary thing before we get into this that's important. Creativity is spending money to come up with ideas. Innovation is it's taking those ideas and spending them to make more money. How you do that is very different depending on the type of organization that you are. right? So how you do the activity of spending money to come up with ideas and then spending ideas to make more money. This is a bit of an eye chart. Don't worry, like there's no test on this, and it's not that relevant. I'm just trying to illustrate a point quickly here, so that is kind of adjacent to you guys. If you're a traditional startup, spend time talking to venture capitalists to give you money to spend money to come up with ideas. If you're a corporation, you do a different thing, right? You spend money from your company's balance sheet to come up with ideas to deliver more money. In a lot of the worlds that you guys are in, right? You're spending time with donors who can support the work that you're doing to come up with ideas, right? But so the point is, like, this activity we're talking about translates to lots of different settings there. And hopefully at this point you get the sense, like, I am very, very pro entrepreneurship, right? That's kind of what I do. So one way to look at what I do all day, remember I spend all day convincing people to be entrepreneurs, is I spend all day convincing people to do things with a 4% success rate. So there's a very, very obvious question here, right? Which is, well, how do you look in the mirror? And I'm okay with this for two reasons. One, innovation is very asymmetric. The activity I'm encouraging you to do within the portfolio of activities your organizations do, you can lose up to the time and money you invest in it, but the upside is uncapped. Innovation is uncapped. You can lose up to the time and money invested, but the upside is uncapped, right? So that's point number one. Point number two is we can do better than 4%. And I'm going to talk to you between now and later this afternoon about how we do better than 4%. How do we go from 4% to 30%? And this is really important, because if we're going to do that, we need to first ask ourselves, okay, well, why do most innovative projects that don't work out, that end up at that 70%, why do most of those fail? And there's a bunch of answers that you could give, right? So typically when I ask this in a smaller setting, we have a chance to go back and forth. The first answer is like, oh, because they run out of money. And like, technically that is the correct answer. Like, most startups do fail because they run out of money, but the reason they run out of money is actually like a symptom of the real problem. And then people say something like, well, I bet most innovative projects fail because they couldn't build what they set out to build. And that's a very popular answer at a place like Carnegie Mellon, because we really value builders. And you might have heard we have a lot of really, really good engineers here. If you haven't, you'll hear a lot about that tomorrow. It's true, we have really, really good engineers here. The truth is, unfortunately, that's not true. I wish that was true. I wish most startups failed because they weren't able to build what they set out to build, because it would make entrepreneurship a really fair activity. The truth is that most startups fail because nobody actually wants what they've built. Or more accurately, unfortunately, not enough people care enough about what's been built for it to actually matter. So when you think about innovation, one of the things that everybody wants to know is, what are the facts about the idea that you're exploring? And the nightmare way to do this is to sit in a conference room and discuss the facts about an idea, right? The facts about an idea as it relates to innovation are outside the building. And I'm not the only one advocating this. It turns out that people have written sort of multiple best-selling business books about this. And probably one of the most popular ones is a book by a guy named Eric Ries called The Lean Startup. You basically come up with an idea. Eric calls those an MVP. You take that MVP, you put it in front of customers, you measure their reaction to the thing that you built, you learn from what you just measured, and then you build the next thing. And you iterate through this build, measure, learn cycle over and over and over again, right? And that is basically the lean startup. Usually at this point in the conversation, somebody raises their hand and they say one of two quotes. And the quote depends on how old they are, which of the two quotes they use. So if they're a little older than me, they usually say something like, well, have you heard the Henry Ford quote? If I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. Or if you're about 10 years younger, even 5 years younger than me, they say something like, well, nobody knew they wanted the iPhone till we came up with the iPhone. So like, are you sure that the facts are really outside the building? And this is what's important here. So in both those cases, I think the quotes or the sort of statements are a little off. So I don't know a lot about horses, but I actually think if you'd ask people who spend time with horses, and I have friends who have, what they want, they would not have told you a faster horse. They'd have told you a horse that they don't have to clean up after. I think that would have quickly been the first answer for what they would have wanted. Or maybe a horse that doesn't sleep, right? And I'm not sure how many of you guys were BlackBerry users, but I was a BlackBerry addict, right? If you were a BlackBerry addict, you remember that like you might not have known that the solution is a single pane of glass phone, but you absolutely knew that you wanted a phone that wasn't terrible at browsing the web. And the way you knew that is that when you got off the subway, all the emails that had links in them you hadn't dealt with, you need to deal with those at your desktop, but all the emails that were just text you had responded to, right? So we absolutely knew the problem. Now, in both those cases, it took an entrepreneur to know that the solution to a horse you don't have to clean up out there is a combustion engine, and the solution to a phone that can open web pages is getting rid of a keyboard, right? So entrepreneurs are good at coming up with solutions, but customers are really good at telling you what their problems are. And so what you're doing with this build, measure, learn cycle is you're getting out there, you're taking your vision, you're putting customers reaction in front of that to understand, do they actually care about the things or not? And then you're measuring and learning, right? So customers great at telling you the problems they have. Entrepreneurs great at coming up with the solutions to those problems. So in terms of how you do this, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but the point is if you want to do this well, you also need to change the process by which you actually build these things. Because if it takes you months to do the build in that build, measure, learn cycle, right, it's going to be really hard to learn fast enough. So the question becomes, how do you speed that up? Value interaction over processes. Value working products over creating a bunch of documentation. And this became what was called the Agile Manifesto. We believe at CSL that there are 3 things that need to be true for every company trying to do corporate entrepreneurship. The first is, when they're doing these projects, they need to work really hard to validate the riskiest assumptions about their business first. Second thing is, they're really good at distinguishing 2 things that we, in America at least, use the same word to describe both of these things. We talk about failure, and sometimes what we mean when we say failure is there was a failure in the actual concept that I had, right? I had these hypotheses, they turned out to be incorrect. I quickly proved those were incorrect, and so I killed the idea. And then sometimes what we mean when we say failure is, oh, I failed, like I didn't do the right kind of work. Well, those are 2 very different things. And what we would say is for corporations that are good at entrepreneurship, they distinguish between these 2 types of failure because they're very different. If you have a failure as in like the concept's a bad concept, but your team figures it out quickly, the right reaction is not to send them back to stop doing innovation, is to find another project to put them on quickly. If they have a failure because they didn't work hard, then they need to get a different job. Like, these are very, very different failure modes, and we need to delineate between the 2 of them. The third one is that they spend a bunch of time up front trying to understand the anticipated value of an idea. This does not say how likely the idea is to succeed. A question that humans gravitate to trying to answer that we're not very good at answering is, what's the probability of this individual idea succeeding or failing? We're not good at that question, and it turns out we're so bad at it, I've become pretty convinced that it's actually a waste of time on the front end to spend a bunch of time thinking about. That said, there's a related question that we're actually really good at answering that turns out is a lot more important, which is, if this idea succeeds, how impactful could it be? So if someone comes to you in your organization and says, hey, I really want to do this transformational innovation, asking the question like, well, how likely do you think it is to work out? Wasted conversation. Asking them, well, if it works, like, how does it change my organization to be, to serve our customers better? That's a great conversation to have. Then there's 5 things which what we found is like, it doesn't matter how you answer these. We have good examples of companies succeeding and failing in both cases, but this is really important. What does matter is making sure you're clear your position on this. 1, do you want everybody in your company working on transformational innovation, or do you want to have like skunk work teams doing that? How important are financial incentives to doing this? It's probably a little less relevant here. How do you actually think about the portfolio approach of what you're doing? What's the ratio of incremental, adjacent, and transformational? How constrained are the types of projects you're working on? What's the right approach for you to be collaborating with other groups on this? I want to just give you 2 potential next steps. So this is called pitching innovation to the C-suite. what we came to appreciate is corporate entrepreneurs actually need to be really, really good at defending their idea from a bunch of different people's perspective. And so what we did is we actually went and gathered the types of questions that people from different functions in an organization tend to ask as it relates to innovative projects. It's been incredibly valuable in the Corporate Startup Lab for corporate pitches, and I thought it might be helpful for you. So the second one, so I also wrote a YouVersion study plan, and the context behind this is that grad students come to my office all the time and they say like, hey, I want a really good case study on being an entrepreneur. And we do a bunch of those in class. For years, I would say to them, like, look, there's this story about this guy, and he works for this really evil manager. And he goes out and finds that the place that he came from is really broken down, and he's got to convince his manager to give him money to go bring restoration there by starting a bunch of businesses and restoring the economy in this neighboring community. And people are like, oh, that sounds like that's exactly the kind of case study I'm looking for. Cool. So it turns out it's in this book that you don't want to read, but I would really encourage you, you don't have to read the rest of the book, but I'd really encourage you to read this. It's in the Bible, but if you just skip the other books, it's fine. Just go to this book called Nehemiah and you can read this and learn about it. Now, what's fascinating is, and you guys know this, if you get people to read a book in the Bible, it's really amazing how they'll tend to read other books of the Bible. And there's something there's something literally supernatural about reading the Bible. So it's actually fascinating when you can get them to do it. So I was having this conversation with the YouVersion guys because I had written some other studies for them on other topics. And they said, well, you know what we'll do with you? We'll turn this into like a YouVersion site that they can read online without needing to download the whole Bible. So the actual original intent of this has nothing to do with all of you guys. It was a way for me to give my students a guided way to read through this book without needing them to get the other books of the Bible along with it. But as I was thinking about this last night and praying about like what might be helpful for you, I really felt like some of the things we talk about in there may be helpful for your organizations as well, because I do think Nehemiah is an amazing story of applying an entrepreneurial mindset to actually bring transformation to places. So again, it's all free, no obligation, but I thought that might be an interesting next step for you as well. So the next thing we're gonna do is probably gonna feel a little more awkward. It's a little harder to simulate, but it's another important technique that I want to talk about, which is what I call manual prototypes. So the idea behind a manual prototype is that often a lot of the ideas that you guys are thinking about in terms of different entrepreneurial solutions are actually automating things that if you didn't care about cost at all, you could just put a lot of human capital against it to do the work. And so the idea behind a manual prototype is to just do these in non-scalable ways at first to make sure you solve the problem and solve a real problem before you go build the solution that actually does it in a scalable way. And so you can kind of think about this as step one being, you do some kind of input. Step two, something magical happens. And step three, you see the output. I'm going to give one software example here just to kind of illustrate this, and then I'm going to give a robotics example that hopefully will sort of flush out the edges of this example. So there's two really big benefits to doing this type of thing. Everything up till this point has been trying to get people to imagine what their behavior would be, right? And in the first case, there's this real big risk of them trying to be nice to you. In the second case, the fact that they're being honest with the storyboards makes that a little bit lower risk. But here's the reality. People aren't that good at predicting what their behavior is going to be. If we were, all the things that we said we were going to do January 1st of this year, we'd still be doing, right? We're not good at predicting our behavior. Like, we're just not. And so the nice thing about manual prototypes is you're not trying to get people to predict what their behavior will be. You're trying to actually see what their behavior is. And the other big benefit is that oftentimes when the solution is inherently an automation solution, doing it manual first helps you really flush out what the idea is. So let me give you two examples. The first is actually from a grad student of mine that we later invested in his company. His name was Lars, and Lars came to me and said, he was a student in the computer science master's program here, and he said, hey, I think what would be really cool would be to build a piece of AI software that could read contracts. And I was like, yeah, that would be cool. Like, that would be awesome. He's like, yeah, I want software to do what lawyers do. It's like, interesting. That's very cool. And so we started talking about it, and spent some time kind of understanding like what he had in mind. And it was like, okay, cool. So the idea would be that you would upload a document. This AI system would read the document, pull out key attributes of the document, and then make recommendations to you. Let's imagine we could build that. What kind of things would people want to do with the computer system that could read contracts and make recommendations from it? And the problem is you can imagine millions of uses for technology like that, right? So you could imagine it keeping track of all the contracts you've signed. You could imagine it as like legal spell check. You could imagine it as picking like non-disclosure agreements, which are really, really common contracts businesses do with each other to not disclose information about the relationship. So what we did is we literally built we built a site that implied it worked. We said it was invitation only, right? Because we didn't want lots of people using it. And we said, upload the file, fill out this information, what you want from it. And then we hired paralegals to actually go and pull the information out of the contract and send it back to them. Now, we only did this like 10 times, but it was really helpful to understand like what kind of data people wanted out of contracts. And then that made it much easier for us to build automated systems that done. I mean, Legal Sifter today has read millions of contracts, right? We would never have scaled with an army of paralegals, right? The goal was not, let's build the largest network of paralegals in the world. The goal was, let's have software do this. But the first step was having humans do the work, right? Because it was a manual prototype that we started with. My favorite example of this actually comes up from a book that James and I were talking about just a minute ago, which is called The Sprint. If you haven't read this book yet, it's a great resource. It walks through a process that Google Ventures uses with their portfolio companies, where they take 1 week, and in this very defined 1 week process, they actually go prove something about those customers for their startups. And they have like day-by-day steps that you go through. The book is called The Sprint. James, maybe in the chat, Slidio or whatever, cool. So one of the main prototypes, though, comes from a robotics story that they did. So Google Ventures invested in this company that wanted to put robots in hotels. And the idea behind the robots in the hotels were that it turns out in most hotels, one of the staff that's hardest for them to keep appropriately staffed is the people who run things up to your room when you call down to the main desk, right? So say you get to your hotel room and you realize that like you forgot a toothbrush, and so you call the main desk and say, could you send me up a toothbrush? Right? The people who make those runs, it's just a very difficult thing for hotels to keep staffed, and it's a pretty easily like that's much easier than self-driving cars, right? Like it's a very defined space. It's a pretty rote task, but there's all kinds of important questions for a startup trying to build robots in hotels. Namely, how would you react if you opened your door and there was a robot there instead of a human? So what these guys decided to do was rent 2 hotel rooms, and they told the hotel what they were doing. But what they decided to do was rent 2 hotel rooms about 5 doors away from each other, and then put an ad on Craigslist to get people to come do a user study with them. And so people came to the hotel room to like sort of knowing that they were trying out a new product. And the person walks in and they say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Pretend you're on a business trip. And you open your suitcase, and when you look inside, you realize you forgot the toothbrush. What would you do next? And the person says, oh, I would call to the front desk and ask them to send me up a toothbrush. And the Google Ventures person running the process goes, great, call the front desk. But they didn't know is that the phone had been jerry-rigged, that when they called the front desk, they were actually calling 5 doors down. But they knew that the person was going to ask for a toothbrush. So the person says, hey, can you send me a toothbrush? Person on the other end of the phone says, absolutely, hangs up the phone. And then they rigged, this is not it, this is actually the finished product, but a sort of a robot that looked like that, except for it was controlled by an Xbox controller. And it had a screen like this, except for it was just an iPad taped to the front of it. And it had screens that you thought you were clicking through, except for they knew that you were going to ask for a toothbrush. So you're really just advancing slides on the iPad. And then when you got done, the person who was down the hall was mirroring what was on the iPad. So they knew when you were done, they pushed a button, the thing opened, and there's a toothbrush inside, right? They were able to do this 8 times over a day. They learned all kinds of interesting things, like how do people react to when a robot shows up at the front door, because nobody said that was going to happen. Now, there were a ton of things that they had not built yet. For example, they hadn't built the software to navigate the robot around the hotel. They also hadn't built the software to pick the toothbrush out of the supply room. They also hadn't built the software to know what should be and should not be included in what the robot could deliver, right? There's a bunch of things that weren't done yet. That's okay. The biggest risk in their mind was, how will somebody interact with the robot showing up at their front door? And they were able to simulate that through this manual prototype. Now, the last thing I want to do is as we wrap this up, is to give you a framework for how to think about this. What I want to encourage you guys to do is think about, for each of these that you're doing, each MAP, some type of dashboard like this, where you sequentially keep track of what's happening. So the idea is the first one you build, right? What is it? You fill that in at the top box there. How does the customer interact with it? What are you hoping to learn? And how much is it costing you to do that? And the idea is that over time, your learning objective becomes more precise and the amount of money that you're spending increases. We said at the beginning of the panel how it doesn't take a ton of money to innovate, right? We built 3 MAPs in about an hour and 45 minutes. You could go back to your organizations, continue what you're doing, share your CPS statement with them so they actually understand who the customer is, problem, solution. Sometimes that's really clarifying for organizations. I've had employees where I've sat down, work with the management team on it, and then we've shared our CPS statement with the organization, be like, wow, I never really thought that that's an important qualifier on our customer, right? So it's that, even just that may be helpful. And then you can go and do these MAPs with them over time through here. So that's the end of my time with you. I will be with you tonight in the Schwartz Center, but thanks so much for your time. It really was an honor today.